Welcome to MJH Live, the online public program series of New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Samantha Shokin, manager of public programs, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Transforming Moments with Elisha Wiesel and Dr. Eva Fogelman, presented in partnership with the group Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, formerly known as 2G of Greater New York. Today's program is the first in an ongoing series highlighting the experiences of 2Gs, that is, the children of Holocaust survivors. Introducing our guest speakers today is Ellen Bachner Greenberg, the child of two Holocaust survivors and co-founder and president of the group Descendants of Holocaust Survivors. Ellen is actively involved in Holocaust education and remembrance. She runs programs, gives talks, has written articles, and runs discussion groups for children of survivors. Before I turn it over to Ellen, I'd like to remind our audience that this program is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming days. You will receive a link to that video in my follow-up email. We will also leave time for a brief audience Q&A at the conclusion of the program. To participate, please submit your questions and comments into the chat. Time is limited and we have a very large audience tonight, so we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible. Thank you. That's it for me. And now please welcome Ellen Bachner Greenberg.
Thank you, Samantha. Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, 2G Greater New York, is an opportunity for second and third generation of Holocaust survivors worldwide to meet each other, have diverse conversations, and participate in meaningful programs. We are excited about this series and are thankful for the opportunity to partner with the museum. The moderator for this evening is Dr. Eva Fogelman. Eva is a psychologist who is a pioneer in developing therapeutic techniques for Holocaust survivors and second and third generation descendants. She is co-founder of a training program for clinicians, Psychotherapy with Generations of the Holocaust and Related Traumas, is a writer and co-producer of Breaking the Silence, The Generation After the Holocaust, an award-winning documentary, and is also a Pulitzer-prize nominee of Consciences of Courage, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust, among other publications. Eva is the founding director of the Jewish Foundation of Christian Rescuers, which is now the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, and is also the co-director of Child Development Research, which includes international study of organized persecution of children. Elisha Wiesel, a recently retired businessman, is currently involved in philanthropic and nonprofit organizations, studying Jewish texts, and fathering two adolescents along with his wife, Lynn Bachner. Elisha graduated from Yale University, majoring in computer science, skills he used as a volunteer for Michael Bloomberg's recent campaign. Elisha is the son of Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel and Marion Wiesel, who translated many of Elie Wiesel's writings and has been active in humanitarian projects for decades. I now turn the program over to Dr. Eva Fogelman. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and Mar Chatama Tova to all our viewers. And thank you for joining us during this very busy season in which everyone has to juggle and make all kinds of adjustments given our pandemic. And particular thanks to Elisha, who has had to study the cantillation for Rosh Hashanah, which he has led for the first time. And Elisha, thank you for accepting our invitation to talk about your experiences of growing up with your father, who was a world-renowned moral champion for human rights, which obviously stemmed from his experiences as a Holocaust survivor. But we also have to remember that your life has also been shaped by your mother, Marion, who was very actively involved in civil rights movement. She also at that time befriended people from all kinds of nationalities, all walks of life. She also wrote and narrated a film, Children in the Night, as she too herself was a child when the Germans invaded her hometown in Austria. Her family then escapes to Belgium when in 1940, they then invaded by the Germans, and they are deported to a concentration camp in France for 2 years, and luckily they had some jewelry and they were able to bribe a guard who took them across the world to Switzerland. Marion is also the co-founder of Elie Wiesel Foundation for the Humanity, and believe it or not, she speaks 5 languages, in addition to all the translations that she did for your father when he wrote, more than 40 books. She was a busy chicken. And I just want to set a context, Elisha, of how you fit in with other children of Holocaust survivors. So that amongst the descendants, we first have all the children who were baby boomers. And these were the children who were born, many of them in displaced persons camps, who were born in war-torn Europe when their parents were scrambling, going from country to country because nobody wanted the Holocaust survivors. Those who tried to get into what was then known Palestine were then placed in Cyprus in camps where they had to wait till the state of Israel was created as a state. We also have to remember one other thing, since you were born in America, is that in the late 40s and the 50s, Holocaust survivors were quite shunned by particularly the Jewish community. And even the very popular magazine, Saturday Evening Post, said that the best Jews died, the ones who survived must have done something devious in order to survive. And of course, the women who were beautiful, the only way they could have survived the concentration camp is if they were promiscuous sexually. By the time you were born in 1972, your father's book, Night, had already been out for more than 10 years, and Alfred Kayser's raving review had raised your father's stature. He began to get a lot of speaking engagements. He became part of what was then known as the New York Jewish intellectuals. But he was very different from the rest of them. He used his stature to fight for the plight of the Russian Jews at the time. He was one of the earliest people who risked his life to go to the Soviet Union and to clandestinely meet with all the refuseniks. It is his book, Jews of Silence, that had a very profound influence on the creation of the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States that continuously had demonstrations to let my people go. In your father's memoir, And the Sea is Never Full, he writes about his hesitation to bring a child into the world, and he says, it is a cruel, indifferent world that did not deserve our children. Your mother, thank God, convinces him otherwise. And he then writes, it was wrong to give the killers one more victory. The long line from which I sprang must not end with me. So I just want to share one other story with you that I got an email from a 2G fellow, Simon Goldman, who's an engineer in Minneapolis. And he wanted to tell us that 40 years ago, at my urging, he attended a lecture that your father gave at Boston University. At the end of the lecture, one woman gets up and says to your father, the survivors are getting old. What should we children be doing as the survivors are getting older? So you have to remember, by that time, you are 8 years old. And he answers, have children, have Jewish children. 30 years later, your father is talking to students at Boston University again, those individuals that he loved and writes so much about. And when he finished, a student walks up to him and says, do you remember the lecture that you gave 40 years ago that told children of survivors to have children and to have Jewish children? And obviously your father says, of course I remember. And Simon Goldman son says, here I am. And so here you are 48 years later. So I'd like to begin our conversation, Elisha, with your childhood. We shrinks always deal with childhood. Most children of Holocaust survivors heard bits and pieces of their parents' wartime ordeals and the losses that the parents suffered. Some learned by eavesdropping their mothers and fathers when they were socializing with other survivors, seeing photographs or the number on their arm. Could you tell us a little bit about what would you, if you can recall, because most of us can't really recall since it just was always in the air. Do you remember some of your earliest memories?
Yeah, so I want to start actually, and thank you, Eva, for that introduction. I first want to say that, I'm aware that you're a pioneer of group therapy with multi-generational survivor groups. And I have to say what a pleasure it is to be participating in this group therapy session today with 600 of my fellow co-participants under your watch as we explore my background. It's really a great honor. Not how I thought I'd first end up in therapy, but it's a great pleasure to be with you. And since we're having this conversation, I want to also say that you're right to have recognized my mother. So we'll start this therapy session by talking about my mother, because you really are right on for having recognized her. I think it's fair to say that really so much of what my father accomplished, you could really say everything since he met her, she shared equally in and was a full partner in the incredible network of talented individuals he built to listen to and to work with to achieve great things, both in Jewish spaces and in non-Jewish spaces. And so much of that is my mother as a driving force, opening that up and making it possible for him. You asked a little bit about my father and how I was raised and what I remember in childhood. And I think you mentioned specifically with regards to the Shoah. I absorbed the concept of the Holocaust, I think, in a very ambient fashion. There was no moment in time where my father or mother sat me down and said, okay, now it's time to read night. Now we're going to show you some photographs. Now we're going to explain to you what happened. It was really something that was picked up in the air. I remember as a very young kid being at the, at the playground with my fellow classmates. And they would say, what does your dad do? Well, my dad was an Air Force pilot in Sahal, and now he, flies El Al planes. Well, my dad runs a pharmacy. My dad does this. I'd be like, well, I think my dad, something really bad happened to him and my family, and now I know he's a teacher. And that was like all I really knew. So it was much more of an ambient process. And, you realize that your life and your family is different when, most kids are headed out to the Hamptons or something for their summer vacations or winter vacations, and you're heading out to, to Poland to go tour the camps. You start to pick up that something's different.
Right. Okay. We're going to get to a little bit of all of those trips that you took. Now, do you remember any question that you asked your father about the number that he had on his arm?
I do not.
And you were named after Shlomo Elisha, after your father's father.
My father's father was
Shlomo. Who died the day of liberation. Do you did you know that early on as to who you were named after, and what influence did that have on you?
Well, let's just pause there for a moment. So, both my father and I were named after our past grandfathers. My father's grandfather had passed as a medic, fighting for the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. So my father, Eliezer, is named after his grandfather, and I'm named after my father, Shlomo, who passed. You say he passed on the day of liberation, but that's a little misleading. It sounds like the soldiers were there at the gates to liberate just as he passed. My grandfather passed in Buchenwald, whereas it happened to have been right around the time of the liberation of Auschwitz.
Now,
and that's the name Shlomo. I was named Elisha, I'm told, because they were looking for a second name. My mother adored the name Alyosha from the brothers Karamazov, but my father wanted a Hebrew name, so the compromise was Elisha.
Beautiful. Now, I'm going to take you back to when you're 8 years old. Your father is appointed by President Jimmy Carter as the chair of the United States Holocaust Commission, November 1, 1978. and he starts to drag you around to all kinds of European countries. You get to the Soviet Union, where your father is meeting with General Vasily Petrenko, who liberated Auschwitz. And Petrenko removes one of his medals, and he puts it and he pins it on your jacket. Do you remember that moment and what that must have been like for you?
You asked me that, but what I'm really trying to remember is where I put that pin, because I haven't seen it in decades and I wish I still had it. What I remember about that Soviet Union trip, I remember a couple of things. I remember that there was a lot of bureaucracy to get through. We were stuck, I believe, overnight in Madrid trying to get on a plane, and there was all sorts of diplomatic issues. I think the government of the Soviet Union at the time was trying to prevent us from coming in, and I'll never forget, you know, my mother said, "You have to get us on that plane because my son, who's so young, is tired." And I piped up, "I'm not tired." And I'll never forget how angry my mom was with me that I was contradicting her at this sensitive moment. And of course she was right. What I remember about that Soviet Union trip was, I remember that being told that we were being chased by KGB or followed by KGB in the subway system. It's amazing. My parents, I never can remember them taking a New York subway, but somehow when we were in Moscow, we must have taken the subway.
Right.
I remember we went to one of the older shuls, and I remember that there were people there that were so glad to see us. They were reaching out to us, just to touch us, just to, you know, see these American Jews who'd come from so far to help, you know, rekindle the spark of Yiddishkeit that so many of them were yearning for. And I remember that my father had brought prayer books in his suitcase to try to, I don't know if they were Masurim or Sidurim. I think it was around the time of you know, the high holidays. I think it was late summer, but I'm not sure. But, you know, these are the things that I remember, the faces and the excitement and the energy that was there among the Jewish community.
So I'm going to take you moving along from that trip. From there, you're on a plane going to Copenhagen, because your father brings the delegation that's with him, and he wants to thank the Danish people for having risked their lives and to show that indeed it was possible to rescue the Jews. And you say to your father, and he writes that in his memoir, "That's enough, I'm resigning from the commission."
That's funny. I don't remember that.
But he clearly did.
I'm
so
glad
then
I had
we
some
have
quips.
about,
I do remember when he won the Nobel Prize and I was asked for a quote. I do remember asking for a raise in my allowance. That I remember.
All right, but before we get to that part, we have a 5-year gap there where obviously, you know, he's speaking out for what's happening in Cambodia, goes to Cambodia. Did you feel that you had some kind of a respite those 5 years before the big hoopla begins when your father gets the Congressional Medal of Honor? Or maybe there was,
I have to tell you, I'm sorry I don't have, you know, clear memories of some of these things. You have to remember, I was a kid trying to live a normal American life. So what I remember from the early 80s is, you know, I remember who the starting lineup was of, you know, for the Yankees, you know, in the early 80s. I remember MTV coming out. You know, these were the things on my mind. I remember getting an Apple II computer.
Okay.
You know, these were the more pressing, you know, that was the pressing business of the day for me.
Okay, and then in April of 1985, your father is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and you go to Washington for the ceremony with your mother and father, and this is just a couple of months before your bar mitzvah in June. President Ronald Reagan at the time gets an invitation from Chancellor Helmut Kohl to go to honor the Wehrmacht at the Wehrmacht SS at the Wittenberg Cemetery. Needless to say, your father, who's speaking out for all the Holocaust survivors at that moment, is appalled that a president of the United States of America would be whitewashing history and disregard the genocide that was committed by the SS. The press obviously is very relentless in wanting to write about your father, what he's going to say to the president, is he going to accept the medal? And you're at the hotel in Washington, and do you remember being the operator, the secretary, the spokesman, and this whole ordeal? as everyone's trying to figure out what your father is going to be doing at the ceremony?
I don't remember that, but if I can comment on another aspect of it, think about how strongly my father felt it was wrong for a president to go to the Bitburg Cemetery, and think about the depth of emotion he must have felt. And then for a moment, think how respectfully he comported himself. Think about today, where when we disagree with something that a politician does, we scream, we abuse them, we call them garbage, we pull out every name of the book, and we assume the worst motive. My father said, this man is making a bad decision. He must be getting bad information. He doesn't understand all the consequences. I am going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And my father had a respectful tone. It was no less passionate, but it was respectful. It was thoughtful. It was cognizant of the fact that he was speaking to the leader of the free world. And you think about how the tone has changed, and maybe at some point we can get into this a little bit more, either with the questions or some of the things that I'd like to comment on. But I think if you want to remember my father in a modern context, and you think about what's going on in today's political environment, I ask people to remember that, yes, my father had great passion for what he saw as humane and just outcomes in the world, but he also had great dignity and great empathy, and he gave his fellow man the benefit of the doubt, even if he disagreed with him. And there's very little of that today.
Yes.
Sorry,
and,
I know you wanted to answer. Know if I remember.
No, well, I would just like to obviously ditto that in terms of the kind of dignity and respect that your father had, despite what Reagan was about to do, and hoping that he was going to change his mind. And obviously, for all of us who were present at that time, we all remember your father's word, that place is not your place, Mr. President. Your place is with the victims of the SS. And then he continued to say, when the decision was taken to go there, you were unaware of the presence of the SS tombs, but now you know. And anyway, we won't go into all the details of the fact that your father then gets invited and he thinks, well, maybe they changed their mind, but they didn't. And through the leadership of Menachem Rosensaft, who was head of the International Network of Children of Holocaust Survivors, myself and others went to protest the equivalence of Bitburg and Bergen-Belsen. Unfortunately, they did not let us go in to protest when Reagan was at Bergen-Belsen. We can only go there after it happened. So I'm going to move you a little further along, and that's a year later.
Can I open up one more parenthesis, if I will?
Sure.
I just want to say, by the way, in passing, look, Reagan was on the wrong side of history on this particular issue of having allowed a Bitburg trip. But boy, he was on the right side of quite a bit as well. And I hope that, when people remember, Reagan in the context of all this, Reagan also did, enact policies and help us get to a point where we won the Cold War. And I think, in today's age, everybody has such, different perspectives on what an ideal society should look like. But a lot of the, most positive attributes of the modern day world have to do with the fact that the Cold War was won by the United States. And I think, Reagan does get quite a bit of credit for that. So sorry, that's my parenthesis on a man who gets, appropriately, chastened for what he's done wrong. But I think also remember that this is a man who did something quite right.
Thank you. And now I'd like to take you a year later, after you're 14 years old, in 1986, right after Yom Kippur. Your father tells you that something big may happen tomorrow, and you guessed it's the Nobel. You skip school that day, and you take the opportunity to ask for an increase in your allowance. What was the experience like for you when your father got the Nobel Prize? And I just wanted to add that whatever opportunity your father had, he used that opportunity for human rights. And that, when receiving the Nobel Prize, again, before that he was in Russia trying to free the physicist Sakharov from and obviously the Russians were very afraid about what he was going to say about their imprisoned Sakharov. And your father, as he accepts the Nobel Prize, not only for himself, but really for all the Holocaust survivor, of course, mentions Sakharov and that he should be freed.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is, so I'll riff just a little bit and you tell me if I hit the points.
Whatever you remember in terms of your own experience during that time.
Of course, look, what I remember, at the time is very different from what I was able to value in later years. Obviously with the perspective of later years, there's so much that I appreciate of what happened there, not just Sakharov, but you also have to remember, my father didn't forget for a minute who he was, and he spoke about his Jewish background. He spoke about seeing his father there. He spoke about the weight of having to speak on behalf of the 6 million, and he spoke on behalf of Israel, which, by the way, I'm sure in Oslo of 1986 was not a particularly popular thing to do. But he said, I also want to speak about my nation, the nation of Israel, and how important it is to me, and what a miracle it is that I've been able to observe its birth, and that everyone who attacks it should know that Israel does the best it can. It is surrounded by people who want to destroy it, who have, historically been resistant and reluctant to making peace with it. And he took a real stand for Israel. And I want to say my father did that his entire life, when it was easy and when it was not easy. So I'm very proud of the fact that he did that in that Nobel speech, because, I think that's not something that probably particularly made the committee feel comfortable, because I'm sure it wasn't PC at the time, but my father did it. He had no problem doing it. The other thing I really, with the ability to look back over time, and I look back to that Nobel Prize, what did my parents do with the prize money? They started the Elie Wiesel Foundation. And it's amazing to me to watch these two strands of work that were created within the foundation, really that represented so much of the soul of each of my parents. My father's work and his insistence on dialogue as an alternative to violence, and the conferences that he sponsored were incredible. They had, the Nobel figures came from all around the world. He was among the first to be able to get, a backroom meeting between Abbas and Barak in one of the later conferences in Jordan. So his focus on achieving peace through dialogue was very much felt. But then you have my mother, starting the Beit Zipporah work in Israel. For those who don't know, this is a body of work that sought and still does seek to help the Ethiopian Jewish community, because really the emigrations from Ethiopia, of these Jews with a different skin color had started right around the same time. And my mother, who had, seen racism up close in the United States in the 1950s and later, was determined that this should not happen, in Israel, this country with a fresh chance, these people with a fresh chance. So the beginning of these educational centers, I think, really represented her soul, and this was done with the Nobel Prize money. So that's all with the vantage of history. What did I feel as a 14-year-old? Miserable. I was happy for my parents, obviously. I could tell it was a very big deal. But as someone who had, lived in what I perceived to be a shadow for so long of my father, unable to be seen for myself, really unsure of who I was, this was just yet another, nail in the coffin of, now I will be defined by everybody I know at my Orthodox school, as the son of Elie Wiesel. And if I ever had any chance of breaking out from that, game over. So there was a lot to process for me. I was not happy.
So when you were, it must have been very difficult for you being in a Jewish school at Ramaz, where you were reading your father's book as part of the curriculum.
Pause. Not true. I don't know whether they made a special break for me. I should talk to some of my friends in the different grades, but certainly my year, we did not read night in class.
I see. Now in many of the Hebrew schools, they read night in 8th grade.
They might have done it at Ramaz too. I actually don't know. They might have done a special favor to me, knowing that it would have been a burden. I don't know.
Uh-huh. So when you went to Yale, did you feel much more anonymous and in being able to? This is a stage in one's development when there's separation and individuation from one's parents. Were you able to have that sense of separation and become your own person at Yale?
It was one big, deep inhale of fresh air that lasted 4 years. It was amazing.
And now that you're 21 years old, you're studying computer science. Your hair, I understand, was dyed blue. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opens up. And I think this probably was one of the first events that you attended of your father's in quite a while.
I'm not sure I attended. My father had an amazing speech. I think he spoke to President Clinton at the time about Bosnia, but I don't think I was there.
Oh, okay. I don't remember. I was there, but I don't remember you being there. But I was told that you were there. But you don't remember. But again, we have your father there sitting next to Clinton, and he uses that opportunity once again to say to Clinton, genocide is happening, and why don't you say something? So after graduating from college, you begin to work at Goldman Sachs. Could you tell us about that period where you tried to distance yourself from the Holocaust, reading about the Holocaust, your father's activities? What were you involved with in those years, the last 25 years?
The last 25 years. Look, I mean, coming out of college, I was already pretty distant. I was not observing, I think, pretty much anything in the way of Judaism by the time I graduated college. Not keeping any part of Shabbos, wasn't keeping kosher. Really, there was really nothing at all. Very little Yiddishkeit. I was pretty uninterested. I felt that had all been my father's path, and I wanted my own. And I think, as a young person in my 20s, I was very much into my work. I took, great pride in working with extremely talented people and learning this field of finance that was really changing under my feet. It was a fascinating time to be in the markets. And I was, looking to lead a great young man's life in New York City in my 20s, dating, having friends, going to parties, skydiving, snowboarding. Like it was a period of just enjoyment of life, kind of, that's it.
And when your first child was born, did you have any feelings about what you were going to transmit to your son Jewishly in any way at that time?
Well, I think you're right to identify the birth of my son as a very big turning point for me. It's interesting. We're all full of, we all can think we can do it better than our parents, and then all of a sudden we are parents, and God willing, and we have to figure out what are we going to do, and what do we stand for, and what becomes important. And from the moment I got married, my wife and I, we made Kiddush every Friday night. But beyond that, there was no real thought of Jewish practice. And then when my son came, all of a sudden, at the bris, thinking about what I was going to teach him, all of a sudden it became very important that he should learn the Aleph base. Of course he should learn the Aleph base. So, putting the Aleph base with these little wooden blocks or the black on white cards, and getting my father to be there to teach him the Aleph base, these became incredibly important building blocks. And then once we've taught him the Aleph base, why not teach him a couple of, brachot when he's going to eat something? Or, why not teach him how to sing along when we do, Shalom Aleichem on a Friday night? And then all of a sudden you start to realize the value of family. And for me, I had such a mixed experience with Judaism. I think in part because I didn't feel the joy. I was part of a very, Ashkenazi style, even though my dad grew up Hasidish, it was a very Ashkenaz experience where there was a lot of learning, factual learning in the school. There was Ivrit, there was Dikduk, there was Talmud, there was Gemara, but there wasn't as much of the actual joy, the sense of what it meant to be around with extended family. We had a small family. There were three of us. It was me, my mother, and my father. My half sister had, who was 12 years older than me, moved out of the house when I was relatively young. And yes, we would have friends over, but they weren't necessarily observant friends. They weren't friends who knew nigunim. They weren't friends who, my dad could sing Zmiros with after. And it was really only, later in life, as I started thinking more about what I wanted for my family, and particularly after my father passed, And this is an important moment because when my father passed, he asked me to say Kaddish every day. And originally I had thought that that was a favor he wanted me to do for him. I really only realized afterwards it was a favor he was doing me, the last favor. Because the shuls that I found were all different because I had to make Kaddish every day. I'd end up in a different shul all the time. And I found my way to Chabad. And all of a sudden I started discovering what I felt was, I'm not going to say a truer davening because what makes one davening more true than another, but I found a davening that resonated with me. I found a davening that was more about singing, where people were really singing from the heart and really, connecting with something. And the tunes and the brotherhood and the sisterhood and the warmth that I felt, really pulled me in. And the last thing I want to mention in terms of, my path with Yiddishkeit in particular is, I'm blessed to have a cousin, Steve, who is like a brother to me, who lives in Israel, a decorated veteran of the IDF, led a very important unit over there. And spending time with him in Israel in my young 20s was also one of the things that got me to open up and realize that, it's possible to practice a Judaism and have a Jewish identity that was different than the one that I felt as stiff that I had grown up with.
Okay, so our program here today is about transforming moments. And so children of Holocaust survivors go through a mourning process knowingly or unknowingly. The first, obviously, is the shock of finding out all the losses that one had in their family. And then there's a long period of denial, not denial that it happened, but rather not something that one wants to focus on. And you talk about, wanting to ski dive and all the other things you were doing. And then there comes a moment, and that's the transforming moment of wanting to somehow connect to what has been lost. And for you, I guess that first transforming moment is the moment when your son is born. The second transforming moment, obviously, is when your father is ill and your father is dying and says, I want you to say Kaddish for me. And at that particular moment, after there's a transforming moment, there's obviously a confrontation of wanting to know, what has been lost. For other children of survivors, it is trying to find out what their parents' experience was like during the Holocaust, finding out about relatives that had been, that were murdered during the Holocaust, taking roots trips, looking up all kinds of archives to find out what had happened to the family. Obviously, with that, there's all kinds of feelings that come up. And ultimately, those feelings have to be transformed into a search for meaning. And so, since we don't have a lot of time, what I would like to get into are the final stage of mourning, which is the search for meaning, which is the stage that you are now involved in. And that is, what do I do with the persecution of the Jews? What do I do with my family that was murdered? What do I do with the Shlomo that I am named after? And you have taken on all kinds of, one is you're studying Jewish text, is connecting to, our Jewish heritage, which has kept us alive for thousands of years, becoming much more involved in a Jewish community, because it's very difficult to be Jewish without a community, and obviously getting involved in other kinds of Jewish organizations that sustain us. So one of the organizations that you have gotten involved in, I understand, is this organization called Zionists, and people seem, one of the things, obviously your father was a major voice for human rights. People seem to feel that your father didn't speak enough about the Middle East conflict in terms of the plight of the Palestinians, and you're choosing an organization, Zionists, that is dealing with some of these conflicts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you tell us a little bit about why you chose this organization to get involved in?
Sure, I'll comment on Zionists, and then I want to comment also on the larger issue you raised about the quest for meaning or the search for meaning, because I think it's provocative. Look, for me, I look at the political spectrum, and I find that on both sides of the aisle, you see good, well-meaning Jews who sit there and they point across the aisle and they say, your side has the anti-Semites, your side has the problem. If you're on the left, you're screaming at the right and saying, oh, your president gives cover at Charlottesville to anti-Semites. Look at him. And if you're on the right, you say, are you kidding me? Look at, who you're in bed with on the Democratic left, when you have, people making all sorts of slurs and clearly, taking anti-Zionism to a point where it is anti-Semitism, completely obliterating in their view, the right for, the Jewish people to have a nation of our own. When no one was there to defend us in the 1940s. So I think that, for me, I look at the progressive left in particular, and I look at the way, the phrase tikkun olam is thrown around, endlessly. And we say that the progressive left is there to achieve real goals that I think are Jewish goals. The idea that, that there should be racial justice, the idea that there should be a sense of equality among the genders, the sense that, a sexual orientation shouldn't leave one exiled by the community. I think that these are real and true and Jewish values that we have to espouse. And if you look at what has happened in the progressive left, where you have voices that, if unchecked, would say, well, Zionists are not welcome. And that's crazy. Are you going to tell me that my mother, who fought for, so many of these causes through her own actions, demonstrating that, women can be as powerful as men, if not more so, through her, advocacy on behalf of civil rights for African Americans, but who was also a passionate Zionist, who believed deeply, who read every word of Jabotinsky's and believed that Israel needed to exist as the national expression of our self-determined identity. Really, you're going to tell me my mother's not welcome? We're going to let, people like Linda Sarsour dictate whether or not we're part of that? That's absolutely crazy. So look, what I love about Amanda and Zioness is they are completely unafraid to put front and center in the Jewish world the importance of some of these progressive values and tell us that we can't turn away, even if there are some bedfellows on the left that we strongly disagree with. And then she equally, and Zioness equally, is there to passionately make a case and say, you know what, like progressive left, we're here, we're Zionists, we're unapologetic, and this is what it means to us, and you can't ignore us. We're here to help on all of these different issues, and we're Zionists. There's no contradiction. And I love places where strong leaders stand up and point the absence of a contradiction. This is one of my favorite things that my father did in his lifetime. My father was committed to showing that there was absolutely no contradiction between living a Jewish life among non-Jews and bringing Jewish principles to the world stage to achieve justice and all of the appropriate things we would want to achieve. And there was no conflict with him being a committed Jew who believed deeply in his faith, who was deeply engaged with his tradition, who felt an unbroken chain going back thousands of years, and who identified as a Jew. So he took that apparent contradiction and said, there is no contradiction. I'm a better human being because I'm a better Jew, and my involvement with humanity makes me a better Jew. It's a circle. And he did that in a number of ways. So that's a little bit about why I like Zionists and their determination to break that apparent contradiction on the left, that one can't be a Zionist and a progressive. But I want to talk a bit about what you were bringing up when you talk about, the search for meaning. And I think that this is extremely important because my father asked me one other thing. He didn't just ask me to say Kaddish. The thing that he had asked me when I was in my young 20s that I did take very seriously and that really stuck with me, and may be controversial because, intermarriage is one of those topics that people are sensitive about. But my father was very, very clear. I needed to marry Jewish. The Jewish people, his line within the Jewish people should not end with me. It should continue. My children should be Jewish. They should have a mother who is Jewish. And he really didn't care if it was done with a proper conversion or if I found someone who was Jewish. And thank God I found my wife. But he was very clear. It didn't matter to him, whether it was a conversion or not. It needed to be, I had to marry Jewish. And he felt deeply about this, he felt that Jewish continuity was one of the most important things. And I think that in remembering my father and thinking about his personal quest for meaning, everyone, often one hears my father reduced to, a Holocaust figure who was there to teach us about the tragedy of the Shoah. But I think my father was much more than that. My father was there to teach us about the incredible strength and courage and determination of the Jewish soul. And my father didn't by accident, look, it's in some sense, it's a cosmic accident. Who knows why he was saved and others weren't. But I'll tell you, the miracle of how my father did not become a depressed person, unable to function, who gave up on everything, who gave up on the world. He could have decided not to have children, but ultimately he was raised in a loving Jewish family with values that centered on continuity and education. And he brought those values to bear in making the most important choices of his life, which were to continue not as a beaten man, but as a man proud of where he had come from and committed to the future.
Well, when your father met the Dalai Lama asked him, how did you Jews survive all these persecutions and losses and stuff? Your father says, we're the people of the book, and we continue to study that book. And you are now continuing to study that book by doing Daf Yomi, studying the Talmud on a daily basis. And that's one of the things that has sustained us throughout the ages, is the sense of continuity. But at the same time, I give your father a lot of credit for allowing you to develop yourself and be your own person. One of the things that you wrote that he said to you when he was ill is, just be yourself. And that, and the values that your mother gave you and the values that he gave you are now coming to the fore in terms of, building your life and the way that you are raising the way you're raising your children. And your father ends his memoir by saying, did you call me father? Yes, son, I called you. And he's with all of us, as I'm sure he is with you, and he is with your mom. Unfortunately, I'd like to ask many more questions and continue this dialogue, but I think that Samantha would like to take some of the questions of our great audience that has been with us and participating with us. So we'd like to hear what questions they have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva. We have a lot of questions coming in and very limited time. So I'll start with the questions that we're receiving a lot of. So this question comes from Naomi. She asks, Elisha, did you have other friends whose families were also Shoah survivors? Did you share any experiences with them? What was that like?
Yeah, this will be a quick one. Unfortunately, I really didn't, or if I did, I wasn't aware of it. So that was not a major part of my growing up.
There you go.
Well, that's very true for many children of survivors who had other friends who were children of survivors, but it wasn't anything we spoke about as young children, so we didn't necessarily know.
Next question.
Next question comes from Aria. What do you think of the latest claims conference study that says that 19% of people believe that Jews caused the Holocaust, in addition to other really startling statistics?
Boy.
A very short answer. Okay, next question comes from Shira. Many adults and youth read some books by your father and get the impression that he is an atheist and is not observant. Do you think that it is relevant to ask what your father's attitude towards prayer and Jewish observance, such as keeping Shabbat and Kashrut, was?
Yeah, my father kept Shabbos. My father kept kosher. He davened every day. One of the big sadnesses of my life is I didn't understand how valuable all that was until much later. And there's so many Shabbatot I could have spent with him in shul or otherwise. But my father was he was a devout Jew. He didn't force it on others. I mean, he didn't force it on me, so he wasn't going to force it on others. but he traveled everywhere. He had a pair of tefillin in his Boston University office. He had tefillin everywhere he went. He was always traveling the world, and everywhere he went, he would try to leave a pair of tefillin there just in case, he needed to get to an emergency pair of tefillin. His faith was extremely important to him. And I think that the question, whoever asked the question, is onto something, which is that the memory of my father is so tilted towards his actions on the world stage within non-Jewish circles. And then, yes, there are those within the Jewish world who knew him, who got to know, and those who read his more Hasidic books, who understand just how deep a part of him that was. But I think that there is a broad lack of understanding on the world stage, or broadly today, of just how critical it was. So one of the things that I do is that I do spend time doing is trying to make sure that on the various websites that refer to him and otherwise, I try to pull that out and bring it forward. I think it's an incredibly, it's the core of who he was.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, our viewer, Andrea, asks if you ever asked your father how he continued to believe in God.
We had many fights about God. I don't know that I was ever quite so polite or dispassionate. I was an angry young man in my teens and 20s, distant, eager to get distant from all of this stuff. And he said, when we would talk about things like that, he would say, look, what matters to me is that, whether or not there is a God is something we'll only know for sure, one day. But, what I know is that my father, followed these practices, and my father's father did, and my father before that. And, going back through those thousands of years gives me an incredible solidity. It gives me an incredible platform from which to work. It gives me a set of values, and it gives me a knowledge base that I can go ever deeper into. And when I ask these big questions, I feel like I'm not asking them alone. I'm asking them with these centuries and centuries of poskim and rabbanan that have been thinking about this with us. And that gave him great strength.
Amazing, thank you. Question from an anonymous viewer. How do you talk about the Holocaust with your children and their expectation to carry the stories forward?
My son really only read Night, I think when he was like 9 years old or whatever it was, when my father passed. That's when he decided to pick up Night and read it. He was, I have to do the math, I guess he was 11 at the time. I haven't made a big deal of continuing the story of the Holocaust with my kids. What I have done, and this is, I think, my number one job on this planet, I have invested very heavily in Yiddishkeit with my kids. So, for me, a week well spent is getting them to learn Rosh Hashanah Trop and Laning, at the Rosh Hashanah service we just had. Like, that to me is the holiest calling I could be spending my time. It's the most meaningful thing I could be doing, both in the context of my father and just personally. So I don't spend as much time on the Holocaust. I do spend a lot of time making sure that there's more and more moments of joy. If I had to say that there's one way in which I try to grow the Yiddishkeit of our family, it's more and more moments of joy. If around the Shabbos dinner table when I was growing up, we did Shalom Aleichem and Kiddush, well, then with my kids, we're going to also do Eshes Chayil, and we're going to do a full benching at the end of Shabbos. And I added every year. So when we started, it was just Shalom Aleichem and Kiddush, and then 2 years ago, we added Eshes Chayil, and then last year, I decided we were going to start doing the full benching. And, if I feel like I want my kids to be more plugged in, last year we also started giving them $1 every morning to put in that tzedakah box that they should be thinking. And then every Rosh Chodesh, we sit there and we divide it up and pick up a Jewish charity. To me, the single most important and meaningful thing I can do is to deepen my kid, not in Holocaust memory, though that will come later and it's important. It's in Jewish identity.
I would like to just ditto that, in that I think that the most important thing for raising young Jewish children is to give them a positive sense about being Jewish. And I think what Elisha is doing is just what, as a psychologist, I would recommend. And particularly to envelop, young children with the persecution of the Jews. It's not going to want them to embrace Judaism and all the richness that it has to offer us. And so I suggest that everybody follow what Elisha is trying to do with his kids, and that learning about the persecution of the Jews, like learning of what happened in Purim and learning of what happened in Egypt, is something that they will get as they grow. But right now, the important thing is, how do we instill a positive sense about being Jewish, enjoying being Jewish, and being connected to our Jewish text?
It's important to me to end on time. That's part of something I consider my brand. Would it be okay if I pick the last question and I promise it will be done by the time we're at 1800 or 2000?
Yep.
One person asked a pretty provocative question, so I love controversy and the provocation. Someone said, do you see similarities between the current US and Germany in the 1930s? And I'm going to say it all depends on what you think of people. And I could, if I have my sunglasses on through which I'm going to see the worst in people, then I could say, yes, I look at the right and I see authoritarianism and it makes me concerned that there are elements there of what was seen in Germany in the 30s. Or I could, or I could say that these are people who have been talked down to for a long time and you heard them when so many of them voted for Trump, and we need to embrace them and listen to them and not make them feel small and not make them embarrassed. We have to listen to their concerns and we do have to talk to them. And I could look at the left, and if I see the worst in people, I could say I see the October Revolution brewing again with the destruction of property. Or I could say, no, these are people who've had enough with police violence and are looking for real change. It's how you look at people, and I think it's possible to look at them positively on both sides.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Elisha. That's about all the time we have for today. I want to be considerate of your time, so I'll close this out. Thank you, Eva, Elisha.
Thank you so much, Elisha, and thank you, Samantha, for organizing it all. And
thank you.
We look forward to our future programs. And
thank you. And I want to thank all of our friends at the museum and to wish everyone a Gemar Tov and a meaningful fast next week for Yom Kippur.